Picture a crowded room where everyone is smiling on the surface but thinking in terms of advantage, survival, and reputation. You can feel the undercurrent. Who's listening, who's scheming, who's pretending. Now imagine someone who studies that room, not to join the gossip, but to map how power moves through smiles, silences, and sudden decisions. That person was Niccolo Machiavelli, not a cartoon villain, but an acute observer of human behavior living in dangerous times. This video isn't here to celebrate cruelty or hand you a playbook for exploitation. It's here to show you what Machiavelli noticed about people, why those observations still matter, and how understanding them can make you a wiser, more ethical leader, or at least help you recognize tactics when they're used on you. If you're here because the word Machiavellian thrills you, relax. We'll give you the psychological sharpness you crave. If you're here because that word makes you uneasy, that's good too. This video will explain the ethical costs and show humane alternatives. Across history, across boardrooms and back alleys, the same levers keep showing up: reputation, fear, narrative, and the performance of strength. We'll unpack those levers, test them against modern psychology and organizational research, and pull apart the costly trade-offs that come from treating people like instruments. Above all, this video will give you a choice. You'll leave with a clearer lens to see how influence actually works, tools to defend against coercion, and constructive strategies for leading that earn cooperation rather than force it. Think of it as detective work on human nature, fascinating, a little uncomfortable, and immensely practical. Stick around. Understanding Machiavelli's dark psychology doesn't make you cynical, it makes you more capable of choosing how you want to exercise power. Historical context. Why Machiavelli wrote as he did. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote in a world that most modern viewers would call chaotic. 14th and 15th century Italy was not a single nation but a patchwork of city-states. Venice, Florence, Milan, the Papal States, each competing for survival. Armies marched, betrayals were routine, and political careers could end in exile, imprisonment, or death. Machiavelli served as a diplomat and civil servant in Florence. His perspective was forged in the furnace of negotiation, espionage, and crisis management. When he wrote, the question was less about ideal government and more about how to survive and consolidate rule in a world where institutions were fragile. This precarious environment shaped his tone. The Prince reads like a field manual because it was written for patrons who needed concrete advice in violent, unpredictable circumstances. Machiavelli's anecdotes, from Cesare Borgia's ruthless pragmatism to the unpredictable alliances of European monarchs, were not abstract theories but lived case studies. Seen this way, some of his counsel becomes less a call for immorality and more a blunt inventory of options available to rulers who faced existential threats. His emphasis on deception, reputation, and the occasional necessity of cruelty reflects a world where idealism could cost lives and liberty. That context is important because it explains both the enduring interest in Machiavelli and the limits of applying his ideas wholesale today. The strategies he described were responses to specific structural realities: weak institutions, mercenary armies, and personal power concentrated in rulers rather than systems. Contemporary societies are different, with stronger legal frameworks, different incentives, and public expectations. But people's psychological reactions to power, fear, and trust remain relevant. Understanding Machiavelli in historical context helps us separate what was situationally useful then from what would be harmful if copied without restraint now. The core of Machiavellian psychology: descriptive, not prescriptive. At its heart, Machiavelli offers a set of psychological claims about how humans react in political and social environments. He assumes that people are often motivated by self-interest, fear, and immediate incentives, rather than by abstract virtue. That assumption leads to practical advice: create incentives that favor compliance, cultivate a reputation that reduces uncertainty, and act decisively when hesitation would invite danger. These are observational claims about predictable patterns of human behavior, not necessarily moral endorsements. Reader's description: they tell us why certain leadership tactics have traction. Those basic psychological assumptions still resonate. Modern psychology confirms that perceived threats, social signals, and reputational cues powerfully shape behavior. Fear reliably motivates compliance when people perceive real consequences. Reputations function as mental shortcuts that let people predict another's behavior. And symbolic acts or visible punishments alter expectations more effectively than private warnings. Machiavelli's genius was to assemble these observations into a strategic framework for action. The crucial caveat is that naming a causal mechanism is different from prescribing its use without ethical constraints. Finally, the psychological model underlying Machiavelli also contains blind spots. He tends to downplay altruism, intrinsic motivation, and the long-term benefits of trust. Contemporary behavioral science highlights how cooperation, shared identity, and perceived fairness produce durable allegiance. Benefits: Machiavelli often discounts because he focuses on immediate tactical survival. A balanced reading recognizes the accuracy of his observations about certain incentives, while integrating the fuller range of human motives that modern research has revealed. Distinguishing influence from manipulation. The words influence and manipulation are often used interchangeably, but their meanings differ in morally important ways. Influence can be transparent and consensual. You present reasons, appeal to shared values, and persuade someone to join a course of action. Manipulation, by contrast, involves deception, hidden motives, and the deliberate subversion of another's autonomy. Machiavelli's work occupies a difficult zone here because many of his tactics, signaling strength through staged actions, withholding information to control outcomes, can slide from influence into manipulation depending on intent and transparency. Why does this distinction matter practically? Because the long-term consequences differ. Influence that respects autonomy tends to build voluntary commitment and cooperation. Manipulation may buy short-term compliance, but it erodes trust and fosters resentment when discovered. From an organizational perspective, teams led by transparent persuaders outperform teams run by manipulators over time, because the former maintain psychological safety, intrinsic motivation, and mutual respect. Thus, any study of Machiavellian tactics should include an ethical lens that weighs short-term effectiveness against long-term legitimacy. It's also worth recognizing gray areas. Political leaders sometimes withhold information for legitimate security reasons. Managers may withhold tactical plans to avoid premature leaks. Not all secrecy or strategic messaging is manipulation. The decisive questions are: what is the goal? Is the audience being lied to or intentionally misled? Are the actors prepared to be held accountable? These criteria help distinguish ethically justifiable influence from harmful manipulation, a distinction Machiavelli's readers must keep front and center. Mechanisms. Machiavelli highlights, and their psychological effects. Machiavelli catalogued several mechanisms that help leaders shape behavior. The first is the cultivation of persona, the deliberate management of image and reputation. A leader who projects decisiveness and competence reduces uncertainty among followers and rivals. Psychologically, people prefer predictable authorities and are more likely to follow leaders who appear consistent. Yet persona becomes problematic when it is pure facade, when the projection is a mask covering exploitation. The tension between signaling and deception is one reason Machiavelli's ideas remain morally fraught. A second mechanism is strategic cruelty or calculated enforcement. Machiavelli argued that limited, decisive use of force could prevent greater disorder. This is a deterrence argument. The psychological effect is simple. Visible consequences reduce the probability of defection, but the ethical cost can be high. Cruelty corrodes the moral fabric of communities, causes suffering, and damages legitimacy. Deterrence may work on the surface while creating underground resentment that erupts later. Empirical research in political science and sociology supports this. Coercive regimes can seem stable until a small shock triggers collapse, because suppressed grievances find sudden release. A third mechanism is narrative and symbolic control. Machiavelli understood the performative nature of power, ceremonies, public punishments, and controlled stories shape beliefs and expectations. Symbols create shared meaning and can unify populations. Psychologically, narratives help people make sense of uncertainty, they create identity and social cohesion. But when narratives are engineered to deceive or to disguise harm, they become tools for manipulation rather than instruments of legitimate leadership. The difference lies in intent and truthfulness. Using stories to inspire cooperation differs ethically from using them to conceal abuses. Why Machiavellian tactics persist in modern leadership? Machiavellian tactics reappear across time because they respond to consistent incentives. Organizations and states often face pressures, competition, scarce resources, short-term metrics that reward decisive, sometimes ruthless behavior. A leader who secures quick wins by using aggressive tactics can be celebrated in the moment, especially when stakeholders prioritize immediate results. The persistence of Machiavellian behavior is therefore partly structural. Systems that reward short-term gains unintentionally encourage coercive approaches. Cultural factors also matter. Many societies retain myths that glorify decisive, heroic leadership, even when that decisiveness veers into cruelty. Popular culture celebrates the strongman CEO or ruler who bends institutions to his will and gets fast results. This narrative normalizes a Machiavellian-style persona as an ideal. In workplaces, organizations with opaque power structures and weak accountability mechanisms naturally breed behaviors Machiavelli describes because secrecy and concentrated authority are fertile ground for manipulation. Finally, cognitive biases help explain persistence. Humans often overvalue immediate outcomes and undervalue future reputational costs. Confirmation bias, the temptation to see rules as exceptions for our case, and the self-serving belief that one's own actions are justified all make it easier to rationalize manipulative tactics. Combine those psychological tendencies with institutional incentives and cultural myths, and Machiavellian strategies become not just possible, but frequently practiced, even when they are ethically questionable and strategically risky in the long run. Ethical costs and social consequences. The moral price of Machiavellian tactics is steep and multifaceted. First, there is the erosion of trust. Trust is social capital. It allows people to cooperate with lower monitoring costs and enables complex institutions to function. When leaders use deception or coercion, that capital is spent. Rebuilding trust is hard, slow, and sometimes impossible, a costly deficit for any organization or society that depends on stable cooperation. Second, there is the human toll. Moral injury and dehumanization. Those who are instrumentalized, treated as means rather than ends, often experience psychological harm, loss of dignity, and despair. Leaders who normalize such treatment risk creating environments where cruelty becomes routine and empathy is starved. The emotional and moral well-being of communities suffers, which in turn undercuts productivity, creativity, and long-term loyalty. Third, the strategic consequences are severe. Systems built on fear are brittle. They deliver compliance as long as enforcement is credible but collapse under stress. Coercive approaches breed evasive behavior, undermine intrinsic motivation, and can provoke cycles of escalation and retaliation. In the bigger picture, Machiavellian short-term wins can translate into long-term fragility, social unrest, and institutional failure. For anyone serious about sustainable leadership, these social costs make the darker lessons of Machiavelli a cautionary tale rather than a manual. Modern reinterpretations and corrective readings. Contemporary scholarship offers more nuanced readings of Machiavelli. Some scholars argue that he was a realist diagnostician who described political life brutally honestly, rather than a promoter of evil. Others interpret his work as conditional advice, applicable in crises where survival is at stake, but not as a guide for everyday governance. Both readings invite us to extract analytical value from Machiavelli, while resisting blanket adoption of his most ruthless recommendations. Behavioral and organizational science has added corrective clarity. Studies show that ethical leadership, transparency, and inclusion produce higher long-term engagement and performance than coercion. Social psychology emphasizes the power of identity and shared purpose in motivating people, a domain Machiavelli underemphasized. Public choice theory and institutional economics demonstrate the value of constraints and checks on power, supporting the idea that legitimacy and systems matter as much as raw force. These modern perspectives suggest a middle way. Use Machiavelli as a lens for seeing the mechanics of power, reputation, deterrence, narrative, without accepting his implicit moral prescriptions. In practice, this means recognizing instrumental levers and then applying ethical filters. Prefer strategies that preserve autonomy, build trust, and create institutions that channel power without allowing it to corrupt. Ethical alternatives. Forging legitimate influence. If the aim is influence, To persuade, motivate, and lead, there are robust, ethical alternatives to manipulation that produce sustainable results. The first is competence and credibility. People follow leaders who are demonstrably skilled and consistent, developing expertise, communicating honestly about limits, and making sound decisions create voluntary followership that does not require deception. Competence reduces uncertainty and builds durable respect. A second alternative is transparency and fairness in processes. When decisions are explained and the rules are applied consistently, people are more likely to accept outcomes they disagree with. Procedural justice, the perception that procedures are fair, increases legitimacy even when decisions are tough. This is not naive optimism, it is practical politics. Transparency reduces rumors, builds accountability, and mitigates the temptation to deploy secretive coercion. Third, cultivate empathy and align incentives. Influence that connects with others' values and interests yields genuine commitment. Leaders who understand stakeholders' needs can design incentives and narratives that align individual and collective goals. This reduces the need for forceful control by making cooperation beneficial. In short, ethical influence prefers consent and alignment over coercion, and it works better over time. Case studies: contrastive, short-term coercion versus legitimate authority. Consider a firm where the CEO uses fear-based performance management, public shaming, opaque targets, and punitive actions for minor infractions. Initially, productivity spikes because employees fear consequences, absenteeism falls, but over time, innovation collapses, turnover soars, and talented employees leave. The organization becomes brittle. When market conditions shift, the workforce lacks the trust and discretionary effort needed to adapt. This is the Machiavellian short-term win that pays long-term costs. Contrast that with a company that invests in transparent processes and fair evaluation. The leader sets clear expectations, shares rationale for decisions, and involves teams in problem-solving. There might be a slower ramp in performance initially, but employees develop ownership, creativity, and resilience. When a crisis hits, this organization can mobilize because people trust leadership and feel psychologically safe to propose solutions. The difference is not mystical, it's the difference between compliance bought by fear and commitment cultivated by respect. In politics, historical examples mirror this pattern. States that relied heavily on repression to maintain order sometimes achieved immediate stability, but at the cost of deep delegitimization. Over time, underground opposition can coalesce into explosive movements. Conversely, institutions that built legitimacy through rule of law and inclusive governance might face tough debates, but gain long-term stability and international credibility. These comparative cases emphasize that the time horizon matters. Machiavellian tactics can look effective in snapshots, but disastrous in longitudinal frames. Reconciling realism with ethics. A middle way. Is it possible to integrate Machiavelli's realism without surrendering to amorality? Yes, by adopting a principled realism that recognizes hard choices while upholding ethical constraints. This approach begins by acknowledging unpleasant truths. Threats exist, incentives can be perverse, and sometimes decisive action is necessary. But it also insists on proportionality, accountability, and a commitment to minimize harm. The goal is not to ignore power's darker dynamics but to govern them with safeguards. Practically, this middle way involves institutional design, checks and balances, independent oversight, sunset clauses for emergency powers, and avenues for redress. It also involves cultural norms that valorize responsibility and humility instead of untrammeled dominance. Leaders should be trained not only in strategy, but in ethical reflection and empathy, so that when they confront hard choices, they do so with an awareness of consequences for people and institutions. Finally, proportionality means choosing the least harmful, effective option. If force or secrecy is truly necessary for safety, implement it transparently with clear limits and independent review. In this way, realism and ethics are not enemies, they are partners. Realism tells you what lever might work. Ethics tells you whether it should be used and how to constrain its application to protect human dignity and long-term stability. Conclusion: what to take away and how to act. Machiavelli still intrigues because he names real levers of human behavior: fear, reputation, narrative, and the performative aspects of authority. Understanding those levers is valuable for leaders who want to be effective and for citizens who want to recognize coercion. But understanding is not endorsement. The darker tactics Machiavelli catalogued produce short-term compliance at the cost of trust, legitimacy, and human well-being. For anyone who aspires to durable leadership, those are steep prices. The practical takeaway is twofold. First, cultivate awareness. Learn to recognize Machiavellian maneuvers so you can defend against them and avoid unintentionally adopting them. Second, choose sustainable influence, build competence, practice transparent decision-making, design fair incentives, and center human dignity. These strategies create resilient institutions and relationships that endure beyond the tenure of any single ruler or CEO.